My name is Jabril Bensedrine, and I live in New York. I've been in the US for 20 years, and I'm going to share some of my experience in approaching the US market. So it's just some background about where I'm coming from. I landed in the US 20 years ago at the University of California at Berkeley as a postdoc, and spent 4 years there in the Bay Area. Then went to Michigan, spent 2 years, and since then in New York City. Worked with a variety of companies in life sciences to hardware components, electronic components, sensors, and other sectors as well. In the photonics space, this is not my expertise, more like the general practitioner compared to the specialist in the space, but worked with some lasers, magnetic resonance, which is, I don't think is photonics actually, if I'm not mistaken, but still touching the imaging, X-ray, infrared, and sensors. We represent right now a manufacturer of components, ASICs and so on. So the experience I'm sharing is based on a combination of really multi-sector, always technology heavy, IP heavy in general, and B2B specialty, very much specialty oriented, as well as a few case studies that are from clients, companies that we've worked with that are in the photonics space, and also some companies that we've been interviewing, partly to prepare for this presentation. I wanted to make sure that we add more examples that would be relevant to you, so reached out to some of our contacts, who are CEOs of mostly European photonics companies in the US, representing the US subsidiaries, and asked them to share their experience, how they did it to really establish their European photonics company successfully in the US. So another hat that I have, by the way, is I teach innovation and corporate entrepreneurship at the Engineering School of New York University. I've been teaching for almost 10 years. So we have a very representative survey. Some of you may have seen this form asking you about your experience with the U.S. market and your expectations for this seminar. So this is a representative sample based on 3 responses. Hopefully it is represented, it represents the average. But the 2 of you have responded that you are at stage 1 out of 5 relative to the US, so really beginning to think about the US or not at all, actually. And 1 has answered that you are already established, but not fully, I guess, right? That is scale of 4 to 5. And some of the questions you have, partly we'll get to questions later. This represents what you've been working on so far. You've been to conferences, and actually 2 are considering the US, but for later, not even for now. And others have been to attend conferences. No one really has completed a formal market assessment of the US, and as you know, based on what David was saying, that would be a requirement before deciding to go to the US. We don't know if it really the market is for you. And actually none has a client in the US yet, and no established business. I'm sure that this doesn't represent the reality, so maybe a show of hands who is doing business in the US. I know at least 2 of you represent a company that is a US company, right? So you are actually coming here in the European market. Anyone is based in part of a company that is doing business in the US, other than 2? Yeah?
So in our case, the situation is a little bit different because everything is done by internet. So it's a website.
Ah, right.
So 80% or maybe more is coming from US,
yeah.
But there is no any presence, nothing that kind of thing. So it's that sense, it's, the software give possibility to do a little bit different way.
Yes. Yes, that's something I've actually, one of my interviews recently confirmed, kind of showed that also. I was surprised to learn how important digital marketing is becoming now and has become for US market access. So thank you, yes.
So the one thing is, which we found out is that in US it's typical, you can use the credit card when you're buying software. But in Europe it's not so mandatory. So a little bit totally different, how to say, thing.
Right, yes. So there is still an adaptation, even though you're not really physically there, you still have to adapt, right?
Yes.
Interesting, yeah. So anyone else in the doing business in the US? Yeah?
Yeah, a company has set up an office 3 years ago.
Yes.
And skyrocketed the sales, honestly. Went from almost nothing to a third of our turnover.
That's amazing, in 3 years.
Yeah, in 2 years actually. First year was just establishing, and then it went from not too much to almost $2 million.
Excellent. So, well, hopefully you can share a bit more of the experience. So feel free to interject and share how that worked.
It's your topic.
Yeah. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Very good. So so some of the questions that were asked were how can we'd like to build a business plan, establish which would include a budget, which would then enable you to either raise funds or allocate funds. And someone else had actually 2 questions, mostly what's the best way to use a patent. And actually we've been working with companies that are at that stage, including some that are at the technology transfer office. We've worked with 2 technology transfer offices of French actually based universities that wanted to know how to take their patents to the US market and what is the value of their patents and how should they use them, license or try to spin out and so on. And the other one is what are the minimum requirements or mandatory requirements, the must-have to get to the US market. So we'll try to hopefully address some of these points. So the first element, really statement is we can't generalize, right? This comes from someone who's an advisor, a senior advisor of the Optical Society of America, so he's very familiar with the space, and as you're all familiar with, each of you is in a sub-segment, and like you said, it'd be interesting to have this method applied to the photonics market, and actually we could even think about then even narrowing down to every single of your segments, because what applies to one sector may not apply to the other sector. And so we can generalize, but anyway, today we have to generalize, so I'm going to generalize a little bit, and forgive me for that, but then we can have more one-on-one discussions together with David. We work really as a team on everything relative to the US market. So I'll share some market highlights. So I didn't mention that really before, perhaps as much, but so my sample is mostly based on this past 10 years where I founded and co-founded a company that really specializes in business development for technology companies. And our office is in New York City, but we represent companies across the US, both European companies, French, European, from different parts of Europe, as well as other countries, Asia, and some American companies as well. Mostly coming as an adjunct for their business development team at the beginning, or sometimes helping for specific projects. So I'm sharing this non-representative sample, so some highlights. You all know the market is really large. I've gathered some data. You may have more specific data or even more accurate data depending on what sector you're in. But you see the numbers are pretty appealing. The size of the medical device market, which some of you would bring some component or a piece of the technology that could fit in the medical device market. That's $39 billion. The medical laser system alone would be $3 billion, according to kind of an estimate based on the sources we have. Currently, the optical imaging market is really kind of really growing very rapidly. That's seen as a high potential market, and that's a $600 billion market, but growing. And you see the scientific instruments as well, where some of you probably provide technology that fit within the scientific instruments used in I guess, life sciences research, for example, and that is a $19 billion market overall. So very appealing market in general. And also what I find interesting in the US market is that there are a number of clusters, and really each of them is very rich. I mean, it's a whole country in itself. So you could really locate your business if you were to do business. You could locate it in any of these markets. You see right now highlighted the Rochester, New York, which is the closest to where I am, one of the closest. But there's it's a thriving economy there around the photonics market. What's interesting also is that it really combines research institutes, large companies, mid-market companies, as well as a number of startups. And the startups are supported by sometimes some local grants and research grants that are either local, state, or federal, but also by really a solid investment community. Not only around Rochester, this is really, what I just said is really general applies to all the clusters. And so it's a whole universe in itself. You could just grow an entire business there. And in each of these clusters, there are people who are very influential, who would be perfect for you to work with. They could be partners, they could be joint venture partners, they could be executives, they could be investors, they could be strategic partners that we never will hear of if we're sitting here, right? And actually most people, even anyone else around the US, will have never heard of because they're really very much regional. When I spent 2 years in Michigan, I was within a drive from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and it's an amazing ecosystem just in itself. I mean, I went representing at a medical imaging company for a meeting which I thought was an intro meeting at the Economic Development Agency of Ann Arbor, and at the end of the meeting, I walked out with a $50,000 commitment for a seed funding for this technology, tech transfer technology. And I hadn't even asked for money. Why? Because I was actually on behalf representing a prominent professor from Wayne State University who happened to be a patent holding professor, and they said we would like to support your technology, and the next stage would be a $300,000 investment plus more. That's something we could find really at the grassroots level once you're there. So now, briefly, the other sectors. Florida has a very strong cluster as well. You see the fourth largest. In terms of, these are organized clusters. Not all of them that are in the map are organized clusters, but these are clusters that have an actual association, organization. There's a contact point, you can reach out. Either I or someone who works with me has already spoken with the person who manages the cluster. They are there to provide information. You can, there are real people behind these clusters. There is another one in Arizona, of course, around, this entire area. There are some national laboratories that also support a very thriving community. Another one in Colorado, which is also growing, not as strong yet, but really growing very much. You see in, this is in Carolina, around Raleigh, the Triangle Park, I think, right? It's very, very strong as well. There's 2 organizations there. And New Mexico, very strong. I'll skip through these, otherwise we could spend an hour just on each of them. Now, interestingly, the Silicon Valley doesn't have an actual standard organization, where you could call, you could have an actual association. But some people think it's actually the most important one of the most important in the US. Around Stanford University, for example, but not only. And then there's also further down, if you go further down towards San Diego and Los Angeles. And these are companies that support also all the research institutions. In Massachusetts, it's a very rich but fragmented also ecosystem. So you can see right now there's some links here. Of course, the MIT, but also the University of Massachusetts, and so on. And you could become, for example, a partner of the MIT if you wanted, and you pay $60,000 more or less. This is an old amount, so it could have gone up or down. But then you have access to really they become your champions internally and within the MIT ecosystem. Potentially it's worth millions of dollars, of course, but you have to pay that fee, and then you have to be there to really take advantage of it. The Boston University Photonics Center also is very rich, as well as somewhere, really, if you drive 2 hours west in Massachusetts, you find yourself in western Massachusetts, and then around Springfield, you'll find dozens of other photonics companies. And these are just for you to pick, because everybody is in Massachusetts. They would, typically a European company would go there. You try to go around the MIT, you got Boston, a few of these clusters, but if you drive a little more, then you become, you have the red carpet, because people will notice that you are, notice you and help you. So something also to keep in mind, between the how rich the ecosystem is and how special and unique you're going to be, right? In Michigan, you could have, I don't know if this is the case now, but when I was there, you could raise $2 million as a grant, non-dilutive money, just because they are really strongly invested in trying to diversify their economy, and I believe they succeeded. So I don't know if it's still the case now. Washington also doesn't have a formal organization, but so someone at the Optical Society was telling me that, telling one of my colleagues that he thinks it's one of the richest as well. They support all the federal agencies. You have, I believe you may have the NIH there, and a number of, of course, the defense sector and so on. I talked about the Michigan as well, Los Angeles, and something that's not as known, even though we're here to, we're not here to talk on just about the US, right? It's North America, and but just across the border, Ontario, Canada, has a thriving community as well. And I spoke with the CEO of a German company that actually has successfully built a presence there and has just more collaborations that they can handle pretty much. And he said that actually even Silicon Valley companies go there and invest there and buy companies there because they're really producing new companies on a daily basis, from what he says. So now, where do you start if you want to go to the US and start meeting with people? Well, I just discussed, presented quickly one way, which is to actually reach out to these clusters, attend the events, identify the people, become a member of those clusters, or build your network there. And then you have all the major events that I'm sure you have heard of. But those major events are usually organized by organizations that have sub-events or other events that are more focused on specific sub-segments, and that may be better for you because, first of all, it's going to be more really exactly what you're looking for, and they're smaller, so you can really build real ties compared to these mega events that you have to be there, but you don't. It's hard to build yourself a network, a real interpersonal network. And what's interesting is when one CEO who actually is from also a photonics company there was telling me that there is all the NDAs and you have to sign the 30-page NDA documents and so on. But he says at the end of the day, what really makes a difference, people will work with you or not, is that interpersonal collaboration where you've been talking about really exactly what you could do together, the relationship from scientist to scientist, engineer to engineer, and so on, that you can build. So here you see some examples. So you have the major Optical Society conference, but then you see there's one coming up in in March on optical fiber communication, so maybe not really as specific for you, but I'm going to show you some from the IEEE, which is the IEEE Photonics Society, and they also have a lot of sub-events that may be also relevant to you. Then same for Photonics West. I'm sure 90% of you are going to be there, right? Those who aren't, that's okay, because you can still attend some of the other events they have. For example, in February, later, right, that same month, you could go to San Diego and have an event on medical imaging specifically, right? And then, well, then actually, if you scroll down, which I can't here, but there's a link, you'll find all the other events that could be really more specifically relevant to you. So a lot of things. Now, where I am in New York City, 10 years ago, there wasn't yet, when I started, there was just the beginning of an investment community. Now it's really thriving, and the investors are really interconnected with each other. So this is another highlight of the US market for those who wouldn't have the resources or not enough to really support growth. If you're interested in knowing about the investment community, well, really one piece of advice would be to find yourself one or two angels that are really literally almost angels in the sense that they become your champions. Someone who really understands your technology, who has experience and has money, has relationships, and can then talk about you to people, and they would know exactly how to talk about you to people. And as you see here, this is not specific for photonics, but they're all interconnected through the investment that they have. So once you have one or two of these people on board with you, you are at 1 degree almost of everybody else. And it's really amazing how that works. I'm sitting on the board of a non-for-profit organization, but fortunately there are a couple of people who are also like angel investors there, and one of them is actually a partner in an investment fund. And through him, I would have access to everybody who's in the investment community just because of the phenomenon, this exact syndrome of the 1 degree connection. So for you, the question would be, how do you find that person who can be your angel? I've had as an advisor someone who used to be the head of R&D, global R&D at Pfizer for dermatology. And we actually met at an angel investment meeting, was sitting and listening to tech transfer companies pitch. And he explained to me, he's the first one who explained to me 12 years ago how that works. And he told me, when I find a company that's interesting, I understand the technology, I know who to talk to validate, I even know who to take the technology to. I can then talk to other people who may not understand as much, but have an interest in the space, and then they will follow me. And it's a minor investment for them. They would put 50,000 here, 200,000, and so on. But then they already have the relationships with people who can invest the next stage, that are not going necessarily to invest at that moment. But the person I'm referring to, he took a company public, his own company he founded, he raised $60 million and then he took it to the NASDAQ. So he has done it before, he has the relationships with the investors who are relevant, so in his specific space, and they may help also find others. So this is just a highlight also of another dimension of the photonics cluster, because the investors in photonics are not as visible usually. You all have heard of the venture capital firms that invest in digital technology and so on, but people who have really expertise to understand your technology, they don't advertise it saying I'm ready to invest, not usually. So getting in the networks is useful.
Jabril,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm very interested to understand about this network, how they react today regarding European investments. So some years ago it was quite difficult for an angel in the US to invest in Europe.
Right.
Do they consider today more than before investing in European SMEs, for example?
Not as
Photonics
much.
or healthcare?
No, not as much.
Yeah.
I think so many things have changed since then. First of all, all the collaborations are really thriving now, and there are actually a lot of investors that just are completely agnostic in a growing number. When I started, I think even 10, 12 years ago, there was this syndrome that the angels or the VCs don't invest at more than 2 or 3 hours drive from where they live, and it's not as much anymore.
Yeah. I'm asking you this because I know, for example, the VCs, the trend is that more and more VCs are investing in Europe. For example, into biotech, medical device companies.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the angels would follow this idea of investing in Europe. Is this trend?
The angels probably less. They're more. They need to have you closer to you, and it's based on interpersonal relationships. So it depends also on who they are and the kind of relationship. So for example, there is a kind of a counterexample to what I just said, which is in angels that really want you to be close to them. A company that we'll see a bit later, they're based in Texas, and they said, let's work together, we'll do a deal, I invest, I bring everything, I bring the infrastructure, I bring the team, I bring the clients, I bring half of the money, and you bring the technology and half of the money, but you locate in my offices in Texas. So it was more like, I think it really depends. Yeah, it really depends. And actually, Paul has some experience with this. So.
Well, I'm finding the family offices have more of an appetite for overseas investments than they did some time ago. Do you agree with that?
I've seen one only I know really close enough. And actually two. One is French-American, so they are on both sides. And another is American, but yes, they're really global. Yeah. Yes, and they have, but probably because they're beyond the angel investment. They have a lady who's actually handling the family office. So yes, yeah. I think VCs are probably more.
I think VCs are more.
Yeah. So another source of funding, because this may be a bit esoteric for those of you who are more in technology and not really dealing with that part of the business, which would be the fundraising directly at least. The research budgets are really interesting because this is grants. This is money that is given to you with just a few strings attached. They are called SBIR and STTR. These are really interesting keywords to remember because each of these keywords is potentially worth a few $100,000, up to $1 million or $2 million to a certain extent. Now, and this is per grant, meaning that some companies actually accumulate. Some companies professionalize almost in getting these grants, and they accumulate millions and millions of free money. That's very appealing to companies, to the investors. Now, how do you get that money if you are a European company? This is money given by the American federal government. So you have to be an American company to qualify, and you can't be an American company owned by a foreign entity. That wouldn't qualify. However, you can be a 51% American-owned company, which is one of the reasons why I'm such a strong believer in joint ventures and collaborations and partnerships. Because as long as you meet that threshold, of course there's some scrutiny to make sure that you don't really do that for trying to put a facade. But so long story short, there are a few strings attached. You can't be either also a subsidiary of a large corporation. Even if the large corporation is an American company, you wouldn't qualify. Because why? Because these are only for small business. Small business in the US, anyone knows the definition of a small business? 500, right? This is the American scale, right? So small business is 500 people or less. And you can get a two-phased they say 3, but really it's the money part is two-phased funding, which comes first for the feasibility study, and that's around usually 150,000. And then if you get, and this is just for a few months, and then if you validate that your project is feasible, then you could receive $1 million, $1.5 million. It depends on the programs, because each federal agency has its own program. So if you're talking to the Department of Health or the Department of Defense or the Department of Energy, you have slightly different programs, but generally it's the same number. The Department of Defense has the biggest budgets, but they are the hardest to get for a partly European-based company. Someone said it's nearly impossible anyway, so, and we're not here to talk about defense.
I
So-
have a question.
Yeah.
Is this financed at 100%, or is there
I believe you have to show that you're bringing also investment, yes.
Right.
So I was actually part of one of these for a medical imaging company, and we had to show that we were bringing industry support as well, and the company itself was contributing. But it could be in kind. What they call in kind means that it's a service provided. It's just time that you're going to allocate out of your existing teams. So you don't have to put necessarily cash on the table. We obtained, for example, a letter from Siemens Medical saying that they were interested in the technology, they would collaborate, and that counted as a contribution, as proof that there was, why? Just because it increases the potential to transfer into actual commercialization. And that's what they want to do, to push commercialization of technology. SBIR is typically the easiest. The STTR is more technology transfer oriented, and it requires a collaboration with a research institution. So you will have to not only be an American company, so you'd have to have a joint venture partner in the US that owns more than 50% of the business, but that new entity will have to have a collaboration with a local research institute. So choosing the right institute can also increase your chances, because some of them have a track record in getting them, partly for many reasons, including that it's a process. So you could attend, you could go. I mean, New York City, for example, regularly has programs where they train people. I receive them from the NYU community all the time, inviting you to come and learn how to do it. Why? Because it's in the interest of New York City to get federal money to the companies that are local, right? So that's for the SBIR, STTR. Now, if you want, we could make a test and look up a company that you would consider as your competitor in the US and try to figure if they actually are getting money, free money from the US government. This is an example of company that I found. It's called invaluable Photonics. They do a number of things, including laser for surgery. And if you go to the SBIR, a small business agency actually website, you will see how much money they have received. This is exactly what you will see. So it's interesting because it serves as an indicator of where the research money is going, even before it gets into an actual product, which could become a competitor of yours, but also how your competitors, what they are working on, and how much money they have. And this one, you see, they received 30 awards for SBIR Phase 1, and almost 15 awards for SBIR Phase 2, which SBIR Phase 2, the Phase 1 represent 9 million, Phase 1 is $10 million because that's normal, because it's smaller budgets. Phase 2, it's almost $10 million of free money, right? And here you see also by year when they have received them, and consistently between 2007 and 2017, they have been receiving money. And there on the right, you see what are the agencies that have been funding them. So it also serves as an indicator of what these people are working on. They could be your competitors in for example, medical technology, but then you could actually see that they are doing something with the energy department or the defense and so on. So if you're interested in doing that exercise, I think we'll skip that as a practice, but you can go to this link and then type the names of your competitors in the US, if you already know them. If not, once you find them, you can go and get some data about them. SPIR.gov. And all right, so briefly, maybe I can pause here and see if you have questions or comments about this before I move to the next and final section. All clear? Yeah. So some high-level observations. As I mentioned, I've done a little analysis based on approximately 60, actually 59 companies out of the 80 plus 90 now companies we worked with over the past 10 years. Selected 60 and looked at each of them, how they approached the US market, what they did, what the results were, and trying to explain the criteria that explain that, according to me, why they achieved that result, whether they decided not to continue, they succeeded, and so on. And then to supplement that, I'm adding some content from interviews we've done. These are, so the first set is multi-sector, including some photonics and scientific instruments. These interviews are specifically for your sector, which is photonics. And you see here, we spoke with people who are founders of photonics clusters, CEOs of photonics companies, and also people who work on the other end, the distributors of photonics products, integrators, and so on. So I try to make sure that the experience that we share is as relevant as possible to you. And as you see, what you see here in this picture is a representation of the companies that have started to look at the US market. And out of 60 companies, 1/3 have done the go, no-go analysis, meaning what David was mentioning earlier, which is really that first step, looking at whether you should go in that market or not. And 1/3 decide that they shouldn't. They're for all sorts of reasons, and which we'll look at later. And so that's kind of the proportion, right? And if you start looking at the US market, well, you should know that if you go to the US market without even doing that study, you're at least already 1/3 chance to be wrong. Because statistically, 1/3 of the companies that really seriously look at the market, they actually decide they shouldn't go. So probability to fail is already 1/3 if you skip that step. The second, those who decide to continue, one other third, before investing massively, start to test the market. So they hire one person, they have one representative for the country, they put a little bit of resources, not too much, and they give themselves usually around 1 year, 1.5 years, and see how that's going to go. This is a tricky situation because it's really the best practice in a sense. You want to be conservative. You don't want to invest too much before you test the water, even though the studies, on paper look like there is potential. But if you don't invest enough, what results do you get? Well, you have a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you're not going to get the result that you were hoping for. So you end up with also a decision to withdraw. But you also have the opposite syndrome, which are people who invest too quickly because they know that if they don't invest enough, they're not going to get results. So the test is going to fail anyway because it would be doomed to fail. And but then they invest too much in a way that is not flexible enough, that is not nimble enough. So they don't have the leeway for trial and error. And so you have 1/3 of the companies that go through that test that actually decide not to continue. They consider the test as a failure, which doesn't mean that necessarily they did anything wrong. It's just that they decided to look at the market more seriously, and it's not working. So we can review, if you want, also the reasons, some of the key reasons and drivers for that. Now, how do you make sure that you are in the last third? Because that's what you would want to do, right? And you would want to be one of those last third. They are themselves split in 3/3. Again, this is a sample of 60 companies, so it's not hundreds, but I spoke with people who also are similar consultants, and also the attorneys, the law firms, the CPAs, and so on, and they tell me more or less these proportions are correct. That's what they also see. So among those that remain, you have another third that are present. They're on break even. They make enough money to survive locally, but not enough to grow. They're not a success story. Another third they know they could go beyond, but they can't get to that next step. So they survive. They make enough money to survive. They may bring a little bit of money back home, but they can't really get to the same scale as what they have in Europe, for example. And then the last really third is the companies that represents more or less like 10%, are companies that really succeed well. They bring more cash flow than they need, substantially more. They're on a growth path really, where you can see that there's a trajectory. And so statistically, that's what you should expect. Now, what do you learn from those who tried and succeeded or not, is based on what you see in the right. A lot of them are really very standard. Either they're undercapitalized or they don't have enough cash flow. They are capitalized, but they have a high burning rate, too many people, too quickly. Also, the worst competition is the status quo, people not interested, especially in technology. Except I think in the science, we see a lot of people actually always looking for better scientific instruments. So that's always an opportunity there, because that's the competitive advantage of the scientist as well, to be able to have the new devices that enable them to do something better. Medical device is a little bit more tricky because it's a different industry, but there's also potential there. I think I could go through more in terms of why they don't really succeed, but what we want to more focus on is what is in the bottom of the list, which is those who succeed consistently. They have a solid team, meaning they hire people who are not necessarily very experienced, but they are entrepreneurs. They have industry experience locally. They're not just based on a foreign person going to the US. In France, for example, we have a system called VIE, which are, you can send junior people, and that's great, but it's good if you pair them with someone locally who can mentor them in a sense, and who is from there as well. Also, they have a strategic vision that enable them to go through the multiple, sometimes, disappointments, right? You think you're going to have a client, you don't have them, you're wasting money, you think you're wasting money, but really you consider it as a learning process. They consider also the US as part of their global strategy. So I'm going to ask you a question. Why would you have a whole team in Europe? You'd have an office that can hold 30 people. You'd have, you have research. You have all the expense accounts. You go to the big conferences and so on. And you don't think twice about expenses and hiring people. But in the US, you'd have just one person, right? And that person would be on a shoestring budget, and a junior person who's just starting. And why would the person in the US be just there to sell? And just trying to, we're scouting the market. If you're truly a global company, you would consider that, and those are those who succeeded. They really build a team there as equivalent as their team in Europe. They become one company. They go back and forth. They co-innovate. They develop products with each other. They develop collaborations with local companies, with local research institutes. They become really kind of one global company. They may develop products there, that actually you will bring back to Europe. They will make licensing deals that actually they find companies there that have something interesting and synergistic, and they bring those technologies to Europe, to their clients. And that increases the chances to also make them do the same for your technology. But even if they don't, you know, you could be making money in Europe from the US market thanks to their technology. I know someone who found a product there. He was there to scout, to explore the US market. He found a product that he liked so much. He said, my clients in France are going to love this. He made a deal, he represented them, and that became a money maker, right? Just that could justify staying forever with a presence in the US that loses money officially, but actually that is holding itself. So those are examples of things that the companies I've seen have succeeded do. And so cross-pollination is another one. They also consider that the money they're investing is not just like a pile of money that is dedicated to the US, and then once it's finished, it's gone. They just consider that on a regular basis, on a consistent basis, for example, 10% of their free cash flow, if they do have cash flow, and hopefully they do, if not, then there'd be no problem, but it is for the US market. And especially as, you know, if the goal is really to build a global entity. So it's not money they feel that they're just trying to push the product, the technology. And they've done that. I know one of the companies I've worked with, it took them 7 years to get to the milestone that they considered as being the success in the US. And for 7 years, actually, I was their advisor, they trusted the process, and it worked. He could have stopped at the end of the 6th year, and it would have been a waste. But because consistently the money invested in the US was considered as part of this global company, they were okay continuing as long as it needed. And the team in the US was also working collaboratively with the team in France. So when they were going to conferences in the US, it was the company that was in the conference. It wasn't saying, oh, this is money we're spending in the US. It was really building the company's brand globally. It was connecting with people who were in key accounts globally. And also they were using that as a competitive intelligence, being in, talking to people, bringing back information. They were working on joint projects, so it was fine to continue through 7 years. So perhaps still some time? Yeah. So a few lessons learned and examples so I'm not putting names of actual companies here, but they represent real stories, archetypes. Is a standard one is companies that come with a technology they consider it as special and that doesn't have competitors. Now generally, there's, in the US they say the rule of thumb is you have to have a 10x factor to really be sure you can make a difference. So you reduce the price by 10, you increase the value by 10, and that is kind of facilitates things. If you're marginal, then you have trouble with the status quo. And this is an example of the company that had a software, and they realized that they were able to gain market share in even projects. They were winning, even when they were on bids, finalists on bids in Europe against American competitors. They were getting the bids. So they thought we're better than Americans. Hey, we're winning against the American competitors in Europe, so let's go to America. But that was very different because there were a lot of companies off the radar that were not in Europe. Most Americans are not in Europe. And so they started seeing the tier, not just the tier 1 and tier 2, but the tier 3 of companies, which are companies that have dozens of millions of dollars, and for which the product that the European company sells is just one product in a whole product line, in a whole product portfolio. And the European companies very often are mono product, or just a few products within like 2-3 products, which the American competitor was considered as one line among many lines. And so supporting really like a serious business development effort for a company that is multi-product they can pay, you know, the executives at $150,000, $200,000, several of them go to the trade shows and invest. So they started seeing those competitors that they couldn't see from here and that were not in Europe. And then they also started seeing competitors that were off the radar. And these were the competitors at their size, competitors that have a few $1 million, you know, in revenue, maybe 20, 30 people team, and they're really everywhere. So those were the people they could try to get market share against. And so how do you do if you are in that situation, which is not the case mostly, generally in photonics, because you don't have this scenario, right? It's a bit different. But anyway, it's really about joint ventures, about partnering with people who already have a track record in getting the market share and have the clients that you want. And now I have an example, which is, I mentioned earlier, Texas. A Texas-based company, around $20–30 million, that the French company was considered as a nobody. They were like, no, these people, I mean, they're nobodies, right? No, we want to talk to the big guys and so on. And what is Texas? You know, no, we want to be MIT. But these people, they were really serious. They were nationwide. And they offered to make a deal that were, you know, serious. And the kind of, it was very hard for them to accept the deal because they said, who are you? You know, how can you offer us a 50-50 deal, right? And it's too much. And but think about it. You know, you get all the infrastructure, you get the clients, you speed your time to market. You have minimum risk because you're getting the risk of not getting the clients is very low. The investment is extremely low because you don't have to dedicate resources to build a commercial team, to go to the trade shows and so on, right? So I don't know how you would do it, but if someone came to you and say, we'll do 50-50 on everything you do in the US, right? And you give us, you know, the technology for the US market, and you still have to add some money, right? But I really think it's something worth considering. And another way that these companies succeeded is they don't go alone. So very similar to the topic before, but in this case, really looking at the ecosystem. And one company manufactured machines. They were actually really expensive machines. They're almost up to $1 million machines. And they only had the technology, some IP that represented maybe 5–10% of the machine. And the rest is a manufacturer that did the machine, an established manufacturer, and it's an $800 million company that had, actually it was a bigger company, but in the US they had an $800 million subsidiary. And so this young French company from the east of France, Alsace, they kind of piggybacked on this big company. And the big company had a direct interest in helping to push the product to market. Because every time they sold a machine for $1 million, they were getting 80% of that money. And so they were able to really leverage that, the resources they put in the US market. With 2–3 people, they were able to get really the scale of a large company. So those kinds of collaborations are useful. Another example, if you don't have, and it's harder to get really build a partnership with such a big company, is to partner with a company that has that collaboration. And actually, the Texas company I was referring to is exactly that. The Texas company is a $30 million company. It's not an $800 million company. But they had the collaborations already. They were already plugged into all the channels. So you are a few $1 million company. You partner with a $30 million company, which is itself in the ecosystem. And there you can really leverage also your resources. So that's where it's useful to map out your own value chain, you know, in a sense, like David was saying, and looking at your ecosystem and who could be totally off the radar, but really worth considering. It takes some digging, right? We've done it with for a company that is in the rayon ionisant. I forgot how it's said in French, but radiation detection. And turns out we had to screen almost 100, I think 96 or something like that, companies in the US to start narrowing down to, and companies that were, with multiple sources to end up finding the right ones and seeing if they had the right scale and so on. But it's really worth it because you see, how the value that it brings to you. So I'm going to skip some of these. In conclusion, the market-driven approach, is essential, meaning that you can't skip this study, the analysis, like David was saying. But at the same time, you don't want to get into the next syndrome, which is the analysis paralysis. That someone, actually the CEO of, this is a serial CEO, he's not a serial entrepreneur, but in a sense, he is, because he's been the CEO of US subsidiaries for several photonics companies, European photonics companies. And so he said, initially you just start just enough to learn about the market, and then you start knowing things that there's no way you could know if you only had done the research. So you do the research, and very quickly you test, and then you learn, and then you kind of adjust. And that is the method that is now really becoming the new standard, even in every, if you've taken an entrepreneurship, probably in business executive now, corporations use this method, which is the agile method applied to business. And it's called the lean startup mode. So you'd constantly iterate. You go through the customer discovery. So you still go through the process of market validation, identifying the customer segments, reaching out, identifying the needs, getting feedback, and then potentially iterating until you are sure you have adjusted your technology sometimes. Which is interesting also. Sometimes you end up finding ways to completely innovate. And the US going to a new market helps you to really improve your products, develop, identifying new needs. For example, we were working with a photonics company and talked to someone who was working on, I think, osteoporosis, a scientist, published, really very, very active professor in the US. And he was looking at, he wanted to analyze osteoporosis, and so the impact on cartilage, and so it required very specific imaging, molecular imaging. And so when we just, were presenting the technology, saying, what do you think? He said, oh, I see, I'm actually currently working on something that I'm going to be publishing and presenting a paper, like an intro paper at the conference of, I forgot what it was, not osteoporosis, but something like that, and orthopedics. And I could, it would be great if we could collect images using their imaging cameras. It would be great advertising for them. He knew the value we would bring, and for him as well, because he would be able to collect images that he wouldn't have otherwise. So it was a nice problem to have for them, because then they had to adjust the camera to make sure that it would work for his research. But it's an example of how you could end up finding opportunistically a new market there that you may not even be aware of here. I'm going to skip this, and I have a few more slides. Perhaps you could get to them later. But generally, I think the slides that I just skipped are stories from photonics companies that some of them I mentioned earlier, that were saying how they did it. Interestingly, consistently, they combined different methods. It was never just sending an expat, or just making an acquisition, or just a joint venture, or just a partnership, a reseller, or a distributor, and so on. It's consistently a combination, and really very, very quickly. Not just, oh, let's send an expat, see how it goes, then we'll try something else. Or then, when the time comes, we'll do something else. It was really kind of a snowball effect. And so they would if they send someone, not just to develop the market, that person would be immediately building a partnership, working with a partner to get to some key accounts, using those key accounts to build an ecosystem, immediately build collaborations with research centers, and then try to be on the lookout for a small acquisition. Sometimes it's very small. We see some companies that are that can just invest, for example, $50,000. But you know what? For $50,000, you could actually become a shareholder in a startup that is at the technology transfer stage, that is at just the seed level, and you would be one of 5, right? That would, that's initially this pre-seed, which would be 250,000, and you would be positioned at the ground floor of a company that can become really successful potentially, or bring technology that anyway it's going to be technology interesting to you, so it's not a waste of money. You have direct access to that technology. You build collaboration with that team, and usually the spin-outs, early stage technology transfer-based companies, they have an ecosystem around them. So it's kind of your Troy horse to get into that ecosystem, right? You become connected to the investors of that company, to the collaborators, people who start their companies. They either have worked in big corporations that can become useful to you, they have worked in research institutions that are famous, or they have their alumni from there. So you also kind of co-opt them, and you can use them as a stepping stone. So just to make a quick comment about that, the aspect of the acquisition, and then you can keep building around it, the joint ventures and so on. The other element that I've seen is the last one is really the importance of marketing. It's very perhaps I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's typically technology companies have no trouble spending $1 million on technology, but spending $10,000 on marketing is like trying to get their first child, from them, right? And yet it can make a very big difference. So of course, scientific publications, but using those scientific publications that really appropriately, there are people who are simply writers specialized for all the science, and that can help promote that science, not just because it's been peer-reviewed and published, that it's really building that brand awareness you need. Something else so that also these companies have mentioned is that they always were, those that succeeded the best and the fastest were perfectly aligned in terms of product market alignment and timing, meaning that they had a technology that really made a difference at the right moment, where the market was looking for that technology, and they had something really new and different. Those that just brought something like it already exists, right? In the US, nothing major, really have a hard time. Unless they become like internal, you could be just one other engineering firm, but within an ecosystem of a cluster, and you can build yourself a nice business there. But I'm talking about those who bring technology. That's, I think, pretty much it. Again, David knows I had 60 slides for you, so you can thank him for sparing you the 60 slides. And I'm just curious to get some feedback here about the experience. Maybe we could start with you, if you don't mind.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah?
Thanks first for this nice presentation.
Thank you.
Maybe I can just give you a quick comment on my short experience with the company. But so I'm from a company called Physics, so doing wavefront sensors in France, close to Paris. I joined the company 2 months ago, so I don't know all the history, but basically it started with a niche market such as laser characterization for high-power lasers, and then diversified into other markets such as lens metrology and microscopy. The US has been, let's say, an opportunistic market at the beginning. So some companies were calling, saying, hey, I have a high-power laser, I want to characterize, make an adaptive optics loop. So it was more like a case-by-case basis. The handful of high-power laser facilities, NIF, Berkeley, Lincoln Net, and so on. And I think about 3 years ago, they put one of the guys from the company said, "I'm okay to be expat there." He went there. Then a VIE joined him, and it was structured in a way that they had time to consolidate the existing business, to do business development, to try new applications and plant some seeds and try to select the ones that were growing faster than the others. And most importantly, to travel a lot, visit many customers, create brand awareness, go to all trade shows, spend like half of the time on the road, and the year after, it really had tremendous effects on the sales. So it echoes some of the things that you said. You need to have someone, not just in the VIE and say, take a young guy with no experience and tell him, okay, go and try your best. There was an experienced guy who knew the company, assisted by a VIE, so a younger guy eager to travel and to learn and everything. So this being two people, being not just one but a team, also creates emulation. Like you're not traveling alone on the road and so oh, I'm far away from my company, my family, my friends, and everything. Right. It's like you create a real company being together.
Right.
So
interesting. And did they? So I guess that also promoted the development of collaborations. How did that? What kind of collaborations were developed? You know.
So interestingly, not that many. At the very beginning, there was a collaboration with Hub, French Tech Hub, and people like this who have offices. So the team is in San Francisco. French Tech Hub has offices in San Francisco and in Boston. So they helped at the beginning, and then it was mostly collaborations with the labs directly, with the MIT, with Lincoln, with Berkeley.
As
and,
clients or as
the Slack.
As clients or as collaborations on projects that don't involve money transfer.
Usually as clients, but not only that, also as kind of like some of these big labs organize workshops, kind of pro bono workshops where people go and talk about their research, and it creates kind of a bit like what we're doing today, like putting together people with no money involved, but just to create networking and stuff like this. They created also this kind of networks.
Excellent, thank you. Well, that's you touched on all the points related to marketing also, going to the conferences, being constantly on the road and road shows, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, so it was all direct sales, right, in your case, I guess. You're in that configuration that David was showing where it made sense to be in the direct sales model, right?
At the beginning it was very, so David mentioned there's a continuum between concentrated customers and very fragmented markets. So we started with very concentrated, like really a handful of big identified customers where you don't need to have salespeople, sales channels, like distributors and stuff like this. You can handle by yourself. And the fact that we put people on the field, we went to other markets which are more and more fragmented, but for now they can handle this. Two people can handle this. Now we're trying to open new markets, so maybe at some point we'll discover that if we go more into the biomedical, biophotonics market, maybe if we need to reach hospitals directly, then it will be difficult to address the whole market. We need some intermediate sales channels.
Right.
We're not there yet, but it's a possibility. But so far, it's a niche product for niche markets. So in our case, we can handle with 2 people.
Yep.
In the future, we'll see.
Great. All right. Very good. Thank you.